Trump, he watched on TV for several hours after the insurrection acts on TV,
Right?
and he did nothing. So why is he not held guilty or even charged and action taken against him?
Well, remember,
We have to repeat the question.
Yeah.
was you-
Yeah.
why was Trump not charged?
Yes.
Well, what you said, if I got it right, was that Trump basically watched all this come down at the Capitol and did nothing.
Yes.
Was he not responsible somehow?
It was not just a speech, because he did not.
Beyond the speech, yes, he was watching in the White House
Right.
as this occurred at the Capitol. So it did nothing. Was he obligated to do so?
No.
Is he responsible?
The first answer to your question is that the House did not vote to impeach him for failing to try to stop the insurrection. That could have been a charge, but they didn't do it. So that's the basic answer to your question. The House did not charge him with failing to take action to protect the Capitol. So it doesn't matter that he spent the time watching. The House didn't charge him. And again, in order to make it, I can't picture the Biden Department of Justice charging him with a criminal offense of failing to perform constitutional duty. Let me suggest, and this comes up with Roseanne and myself all the time, think about what it would be like to forget about Trump. This is past. Trump's time as president is over. And he can't even access Twitter or Facebook. Obviously, he's trying to stay relevant. He wants to influence. He's probably the most important person in the Republican Party. He's trying to influence the 2022 primaries. He's contemplating running in 2024. So that becomes a political issue for the Republicans. But in terms of any calling to account for the insurrection that happened with the impeachment, it is over. Time to move on.
We have a question from the chat, from the Zoom audience. Based on this legal impotence, could you convict John Wilkes Booth for insurrection, or was it just a personal grievance?
John Wilkes Booth was convicted, or could have been convicted, if he hadn't been killed, of assassination of a president. A number of people who were involved with Booth were convicted of conspiracy to assassinate the president and were hanged. That was the John Wilkes Booth story. Different time, different place, different charge. There was no assassination here. There were acts that were committed by people like John Wilkes Booth, who were grieving over the 2020 election, just as Booth was grieving over the defeat of the South in the Civil War.
I'm wondering how well resourced the defendants in this big case are. Obviously, the prosecution is a government prosecution, so they're very well funded, we presume. And maybe you have information, maybe you just have an opinion. How well represented do the defendants appear to be so far? Are they limited by lack of funds, or are they well represented?
You want to know how well represented those being prosecuted are?
Yes.
Versus the government, which of course has basically limitless funds.
Yes.
Are they equally capable of defending themselves?
So far, all of the defendants who have entered pleas or who have filed motions are represented by private counsel. To the best of mine, I could be wrong, there may be some exceptions, but I've not seen any of it where they are represented by federal public defenders at this point.
There's so many people being charged, there must be multiple judges involved, and heaven knows how many prosecutors. Do they try to coordinate, and how do they do that so that what happens won't depend on the luck of the draw of which judge you get?
Question was, there are many different judges and prosecutors involved. Is there any coordination between the judges? What was the rest of it, Gene?
Well, some consistency that what you get in the way of a sentence doesn't depend just on the luck of the draw of which judge you get.
Yeah, the choice of the judge, which can be random, just to make sure that justice is dispensed equally.
Most of the defendants, they all have to be indicted by a grand jury. I should put, before it actually, before the case can come to trial, they have to be indicted by a grand jury. Usually, defendants are arrested in their home state, that is in their home district. So if someone from the Detroit area was involved in the insurrection, as some were, they will be charged in the Eastern District of Michigan. Now your question is a very interesting one, and I want to think about that. I've been trying to think about that. So let's explore it together. If you were a lawyer for one of the defendants, and you drew a federal judge who had been appointed by Trump, how would you proceed? Go ahead, somebody has.
The argument is that a judge that's favorable to Trump is going to be favorable on those defendants, but a judge that's favorable to Biden is going to be so disposed against those defendants. Is that the mental contradiction?
Here's what I'm posing. Go ahead.
The question was asked, would a judge appointed by Trump or Biden be predisposed or biased in the favor of the person who appointed them?
Absolutely.
I said I've been giving this a lot of thought, and I think you would have just the opposite effect. Federal judges, of course, have life appointments, etc. But like anybody else, they don't like to be criticized. So if a federal judge appointed by Trump was overly lenient, there would be enormous criticism. And why would that judge want to subject himself or herself to that criticism? He doesn't owe Trump anything. Think back to United States versus Nixon, when the question of the Watergate tapes. The Supreme Court was unanimous, and there were a number of justices who had been appointed by Nixon. When Harry Truman seized the steel mills during the Korean War, judges appointed by him ruled against him. So I don't think the judges have any loyalty. And they're going to be objective, and I honestly think that they're going to look at what other judges have done. Now there is a degree of discretion, and I raised that issue, where a judge could say, here's a first offender, the person has pleaded guilty to simply entering the Capitol. I'm not going to impose jail time, I'm going to put probation with community service. Another judge could say, I don't care about that. What I care about is that this was a serious breach of the ability of Congress to certify. I'm not going to let the person go. I'm going to impose a sentence of 60 days. Now, again, that comes within discretion. What I'm getting at, one, you're not, in my opinion, you're not going to see widely disparate sentences for similar offenses. The more serious the crime, the more serious the lengthier the sentence. I don't think you're going to see any difference between Trump appointees and Biden appointees. He wants to follow.
Would you speak to the legal implications of the shooting of the woman who was killed inside the Capitol? I know one congressman has called for the identification of the officer. Could you discuss that?
Talk about Frank asked to discuss the legal implications represented by the woman who was shot.
Yes, she had
protesting.
She had broken into the window, and she was shot by an officer. The Department of Justice has done an investigation, and it has concluded that she was creating a danger and the shooting was justified. Now, while some on the right have said she is a martyr, etc., the answer is no action will be taken by the Department of Justice. By the same token, if she would file a civil lawsuit, she would lose, because she was engaged in illegal conduct, threatening people in the Capitol, threatening members of Congress. It was within, again, there's a problem. We see it every time police officers use deadly force. That's a whole other subject. But in answer to your particular question, that's what happened here.
The total destruction is estimated to be in hundreds of millions of dollars. What I don't understand is the penalty that is being asked of the defendants or the perpetrators runs into only hundreds of dollars, maybe $600 or $700. How do you explain the discrepancy between the total amount of destruction to the Capitol and rebuilding it and the kind of penalty that is being imposed on the perpetrators?
You're asking about the discrepancy between the amount of damage, dollar terms to the Capitol versus what these people are having to pay in fines and so on.
Basically, you're really talking about a notion of restitution, as opposed to those conditions of probation and the like. There's no indication so far that any of the judges are interested in that, period. There's a penalty for destruction of property, and again, it is not as serious anytime as injury to a person's well-being. It's just not as serious an offense. That's the best I can say. There's a question back there.
So it is a different discussion. But going back to the last guy, is you say police shoot people when they feel there's a threat to life or the people they serve. So yeah, I think that this gentleman's question was that an appropriate use of force? Was she breaking and entering and threat? You said she was threatening them. I'm not sure. I haven't watched everything, but
If I'm getting it right, the question is that she was characterized as breaking and entering,
so
and therefore what happened to her was justified.
oh yeah,
Is there a
no, it's
question
the
in there?
building. I think maybe we wanted more explanation. I don't know. I don't know the case wasn't armed.
Again, all I can say is that the Department of Justice did an investigation and concluded that the shooting was justified. It's, you know, it's so similar to what happens when there are police shootings. Usually, the police department concludes that the shooting was justified. Here you have video of what she did, and again, one can argue they shouldn't have done it. I think the conclusion was it comes within the discretion of the officers, and that's the end of it.
Okay.
All right. I hear what you say about jurisdiction. I hear what you say about judges. Given I agree with you 99 9/10% of the way, because you're a constitutional expert, I want to go now into the details and the video footage. Now, obviously, each person that was there is being charged, and they're going to go through the video footage to identify the people and identify other people with information so that they can determine where each person was and what they did. My question is, are they actually going through the video footage for each person to determine whether they just walked in, whether they destroyed property? Are they actually going to be tried on the basis of what they actually did as a result of an individual investigation of each person's actions and video footage?
The question was, are the people being prosecuted for entering the Capitol? Are they going to be prosecuted for each of their individual actions specifically, which is backed up by videotape and so on and other evidence? What else would they go by?
Well, I think right now, the charges are based mostly on the video and how the FBI agents were able to identify people on the video. It is quite possible that some had been identified and charged, and that as part of their cooperation, they are identifying other people who are on the video. Because I remember, from the standpoint of prosecutors, you want to get people who have been charged to implicate other people. See, you've got a case here, the more I think about it, where there is really no defense. I mean, there's no defense to being in the Capitol, because nobody was supposed to be there. There was a break-in. So anybody who was in the Capitol at that time can be charged with that offense. With the more serious offenses, you have video of people, and most of them weren't wearing masks or disguise. So it becomes possible to identify them. And again, in every case, the government has to prove its charge against that person. But as I say, watch for people who have been charged implicating other people.
Snitches.
Okay, okay, so I understand the idea that you're talking about an individual thing that happened now and what's going on there. I'm kind of looking at it from a bird's eye view as far as the framing of our country, right? So the idea of stopping fascism, right, the notion of what's going on in our country, it seems like we're kind of like putting a Band-Aid on this thing, like putting whatever is going on. But the idea of this stuff happened, and the idea of sort of we crossed a boundary, I think, on our country that I hadn't seen before. The idea of the actual disrespect for some authority. So all the things, I guess I'm trying to get this down to a simpler question. I generally trust people, and I trust the government in the idea of things, and the bureaucracy sometimes in its own way makes it so it's not such a huge change, but there is a change that needs to be made. So with the prosecuting of not going for the insurrection and going for, so that we can have some I guess I'm referring to your sort of blunt wisdom in seeing all this stuff. Is this actually gonna do anything to stop another insurrection or whatever? Or is this gonna start to become like a crazy, like, we don't really notice Hitler thing as it goes and because I have people in my neighborhood that are carrying flags that are just angry and crap. Like, I'm worried about the bigger view of what's going on with people. And usually the law, in some ways, tries to shape that a bit, right? Does that make sense on the question? I don't know how to ask a question on this. Is that enough?
Mr. Sedler?
Well, let me start. We start with criminal prosecutions. Now, there are rules about criminal prosecutions. There has to be proof of the crime beyond a reasonable doubt. And there are sentencing guidelines. Now, when you're talking about 4 years in prison, I can assure you that is very substantial. There are other defendants who may be sentenced for longer periods of time. But all the criminal law can do is to punish and to create deterrence. It is not going to change the ideological conflict that exists in the United States today. But I say we live under a constitution and the rule of law. And we have elections. Every 2 years, the House turns over 1/3 of the Senate. Elections for state legislators, and the president every 4 years. So I think that these are good safeguards. And I have confidence in our democratic system and our constitutional system. I realize that the country is highly polarized. There's a lot of extremism. Anything that somebody says or does somewhere is picked up by 24/7 cable and the social media. I would not generalize from an isolated incident. That's the best answer that I can give to what is a very complex and multifaceted question.
I would like to ask your opinion, and I want to spend a moment to attempt to give Donald Trump's claims post-election a bit of an airing. So first, my understanding is that elections are conducted by states, and those results, state by state, are certified and passed on to the federal government. So if Trump is correct, and there was some irregularity in this process, and many people are aligned against him, so that he might conceivably have a case, in your mind, I know we're speaking hypothetically, but if he has a valid case, how could he pursue it within what is legal and available?
The best answer to your question is that the Constitution provides for the certification of the electoral results. And any candidate who gets 270 electoral votes or more is the president. All of the electoral votes have been certified and counted Biden had, I think, 306 electoral votes, so he is the president. That's it. Now, last time that we had a dispute was Bush v. Gore in 2000. And that involved one state, the results in Florida. It so happened that the vote tiny apart in Florida, and that made the difference. But you know, that's how our system works. And I remember the comments I made that night. 3 weeks afterwards, it was over. Bush was going to be president, and the country was going to go on. What is so troubling about what Trump did is that for the first time, we have had a president who would not accept the outcome of the election. And so many of his supporters, and he has strong support, do not accept the outcome of the election. That's the reality. Unfortunate, but it's the reality.
Hypothetically, what is the highest level of implication we can have coming from this case? Is it the former president, or is it some members of his administration who could be held criminally liable?
There is a question of whether there was some conspiracy within the White House to prevent certification of the election. If that could be shown, the individuals who did that could be charged with the violation of federal law. That is the extent of it. There was some conspiracy to prevent the results of the election from being certified. I doubt if there's any evidence that would support that. We have to be careful of all the news reports. It's because reporters will, and properly so, report what information surfaces at a particular time. But it doesn't mean that it's going to lead to a particular result.
I have a different take on something you said. Okay, I have a different take about what you said. And I don't need to take my mask off. I'm a teacher, so I can talk through this. You mentioned something about House members that might have helped. What helped? My question is kind of an interesting one. I'm a political animal. I've been since 13 when I took on the school board and won at my hometown. That this is kind of in the Democrats' back pocket. How long would they have to get rid of the Republican members that might have helped? Because after the 22 election, if it's gotten close because of how many state houses have been flipped to Republicans and gerrymandered, if it's that close, could they use that to kick out just enough to keep their slim majority?
So far, there is no claim that any existing member of Congress was involved in aiding and abetting the insurrection.
What about the ones leading the tour beforehand of some of the people in it?
Again, it is a question of whether the House would conclude that Representative X was involved in the insurrection. I strongly suspect that the answer is no. Now, there's another part to your question, which I think is very interesting. Would the 2022 election cancel this? It certainly could be contended that this would have occurred during the current session of Congress. But I was interested in this when I first explored it, and I talk about it because I think it is relevant to an understanding of insurrection. But now, as time goes on, I strongly doubt that they're gonna find any Republican House members involved. It's simply easier to attack them in the 2022 election.
Anyone else?
I'd like to switch to a slightly, yeah, okay, come up.
Yes.
Okay. Okay. I'd like to switch to a slightly different area because you covered all the main points.
Okay.
The rest of the world watch these videos. I'm not talking about our viewpoint, but the rest of the world watch the United States. And you know, we view activities of the rest of the world from a higher viewpoint, but they looked at us with a sense of shock, horror, confusion, disbelief, and dismay. So the question is, do you think that the federal legal response and part of the constitutional response of prosecuting these people and responding to the riots on Capitol Hill was affected at all by worldwide perception?
No.
Next question.
And there's a reason that I say that. In the first place, I think that the notion of how do we look to the rest of the world is largely a media construct. There was a lot of, when Obama became president and the Europeans were very happy with Obama, they paid some attention. I don't think it made much difference. Certainly, when Trump became president and dissed the rest of the world, the media attacked that. Now that Biden is now getting criticism for not consulting with Britain and Germany and our other allies before making some very ill-fated decisions on Afghanistan. I don't think it's very important. The United States is the major military power of the free world. It is still the major economic power, though China is catching up. All the other countries have to deal with us. So why do we care? Well, that sounds very Trumpian. White folks attack will challenge me for that. But there is a lot of truth in it. Foreign policy is largely a matter of power. We want to have good relations with our allies, and we should.